I want to have intellectual humility.
Equality, Curriculum, and the Decline of the Academic Ideal, Detroit, 1930-68. David L. Angus and Jeffrey E. Murrell. The question of whether high school students should follow a uniform academic program or choose from options in a differentiated curriculum has reemerged in the 1980s as one of the most crucial issues facing American public education. In its latest incarnation, brought to life by the publication of A Nation at Risk and subsequent proposals and manifestos, the debate has been framed as one between educational excellence, on the one hand, and equality of educational opportunity, on the other. In response to increasing demands for excellence throughout the 1980s, many states and local districts adopted minimum academic competency exams for high school graduation or for passing from the 8th grade into high school, and set or raised the minimum level of academic performance required for participating in extracurricular activities. Yet many of these efforts were met with a chorus of criticism from educators, liberal politicians, and minority leaders who argued that such changes would have a disproportionate effect on Black and Hispanic youths, blocking their participation in athletics and other activities, raising their already high dropout rates, and in countless other ways stunting their aspirations for entry into the academic mainstream. These criticisms echoed a very old idea in American education, a definition of equal educational opportunity, which we believe has done immeasurable damage over the years to the educational experience of American youth in general, and African American youth in particular. This idea holds that the high school must do everything it can to keep everyone in school until graduation, even if this means keeping graduation requirements low and in reach of all, developing courses that are designed to be relevant, entertaining, and with minimal academic content, worrying more about how students feel about themselves than about what they know and are able to do, concentrating on meeting the needs of youth rather than on offering educational experiences that prepare them for adulthood. From this point of view, failure to adopt these measures constitutes a denial of equal educational opportunity. These educational values emerged around the opening of the 20th century, but we believe that they attained their great salience in the 1930s and after, in the form of the high school general track. We will trace the development of the general track and the educational vision that drove this development from its coming of age in the 1930s through a series of challenges to it in each of the next 3 decades. Revisionist historians have focused on the development of high school vocational programs in the 1890 to 1920 period as the key event in the emergence of a school system committed to sorting and tracking students along gender, class, and racial lines. We contend that the more consequential development, both for the long-term decline of American secondary education and for its increasing inability to promote high educational achievement in the face of non-supportive family and social background conditions, is the custodial, needs-oriented general track. We suggest that this development has particularly affected urban Black students and that today's movement toward all-Black, all-male Afrocentric academies is in part a consequence of the failure of urban educational leaders in the post-war period to respond to Black demands for higher educational standards for Black children. In Detroit, as in many cities around the country, the 1930s witnessed a startling expansion of high school enrollments. Many of the new students were drawn from lower working-class homes and had not so much chosen to go to or stay in high school as they had been forced to do so by the collapse of the youth labor market during the Depression. They posed a severe challenge to high school educators. As one leader put it in 1934, one of the most important problems of the secondary schools in the next decade will be to formulate curriculums and to reorganize the subject matter for those pupils who have not the ability to master subjects in the college preparatory and the commercial curriculums. The chief reason for this immediate problem is the economic situation, which has forced into the secondary schools thousands of people who formerly left school at the age of 16 or 17 to go to work. In the 1920s, educators assumed that these students either would have left school for work or have been absorbed into the wide variety of vocational curricula offered by the high schools. The Depression had the twofold impact of causing educators to lose faith in the vocational training function of the high school and to speak quite openly of the school's custodial responsibility. The key to meeting this new responsibility was steering students away from the more rigorous college preparatory or vocational curricula, which educators assumed were too difficult for these students, and into less demanding programs. During the 1920s, Detroit high school students followed one of 4 curricular tracks: college preparatory, technical, commercial, or general. Students entered the tracks on the basis of standardized test scores, grades, teacher recommendations, and family consultations with counselors or administrators. Because the general curriculum was the least rigorous intellectually and had the largest number of elective courses, school administrators believed it was the best place to absorb many of the Depression-era students. As early as 1932, however, school officials found an alarming rise in the number of failures in that program. With teenage unemployment running as high as 50%, school leaders in Detroit believed that it was their social as well as their educational responsibility to keep students in school and, therefore, sought ways to reduce the failure rate. In response to that goal, curriculum planners began to reshape the general curriculum to make it easier for students to stay in school and graduate. Rather than tamper with the 1927 graduation requirements that mandated 3 years of English, 3 years of social studies, 1 year of science, 1 year of math, 1 year of health, physical education, and 1 year of either industrial arts, fine arts, or home economics, they made it easier for students in the general program to fulfill these requirements. For example, they introduced descriptive science courses to satisfy the district science requirement, stripped of a laboratory component and focused on such relevant topics as how vacuum cleaners worked. Concurrently, the curriculum planners encouraged teachers to introduce into required courses relevant topics, such as traffic safety, into civics classes. The system also boasted many new practical electives, such as courses in personal standards in which boys studied such weighty matters as problems of diet, dress, etiquette, jobs, relations with girls, and personal hygiene, while girls had units on appearing to advantage, homemaking, use of leisure time, bride and trousseau. Teachers reported that these courses were extremely popular. As a consequence of these changes, as well as of continued high unemployment, graduation rates soared in the 1930s. In a previous study, we have shown that in the 15 Detroit comprehensive high schools between 1928 and 1940, the proportion of classes devoted to English, art, and the sciences remained stable, the proportion in mathematics and foreign language declined, and the social studies and vocational classes rose from about one-third of all classes to just under one-half. In 1928, 76% of the courses taken by Detroit high schoolers were academic courses. By 1940, the proportion had fallen to 67%. Throughout this period, educators increasingly used the now familiar phrase meeting student needs to justify curriculum changes in the general track. Although the concept of a secondary school curriculum for youth who lacked clear goals or prospects had been around at least since the Cardinal Principles of Secondary Education Report of 1918, the idea had had little impact on the actual practices of high schools. Until this crisis of the new students in the 1930s, it was widely perceived that the college preparatory curriculum and the various vocational curricula actually met all students' needs. The depression conditions of the large city high schools encouraged school leaders to turn to the ideas that national and regional curriculum experts had been trying to get them to adopt for 2 decades. Once in place, these curriculum ideas proved remarkably durable. In the next 3 decades, educators in Detroit and elsewhere would have several opportunities and challenges to return the high school to a more purposeful, goal-oriented mission, but they would fail to do so, instead virtually enshrining the adolescent needs approach to curriculum planning as a uniquely American, uniquely democratic form of schooling. During the period 1940 to 46, Detroit became the arsenal of democracy, and both its spirits and its economy soared. Thousands of migrants from the South, including large numbers of African Americans, crowded into makeshift housing and looked for high-paying jobs in the defense industries. This migration challenged teachers and administrators to find new ways to deal with migrant populations. The high schools, too, seemed rejuvenated with a sense of purpose. Though enrollments declined with the rise in employment and military service alternatives, there was a clear and present demand for practical training of those who remained. Here was a golden opportunity to abandon the custodial idea, the curriculum based on adolescent needs, and reinvigorate the high school's sense of purpose and mission, at least along vocational lines. Unfortunately, it appears that the schools did not abandon their custodial role and, in fact, used the war as a pretext to further denounce traditional, example, college preparatory, courses. Many educators agreed with Harry Hopkins, one of Franklin Roosevelt's closest advisors, when he declared, "I see no reason for wasting time on what today are non-essentials, such as Chaucer or Latin. A diploma can only be framed and hung on the wall. A shell that a boy or girl helps to make can kill a lot of Japs." As Michigan's assistant superintendent of public instruction put it, many of the so-called cultural subjects, embedded in the curriculum by right of tradition, were not fitting the average youngster to go out and earn a living. Detroit school leaders responded to these calls by reorganizing the curriculum in accord with the principle that all courses, especially those in the 11th and 12th grades, must demonstrate their validity in terms of military pre-induction value, pre-employment preparation for employment in the war industries, or civilian war service. Asterisk students practiced math skills by computing the sale of war bonds, heard history lessons related to current events, improved their writing skills by writing letters to GIs, and in woodshop manufactured crutches and canes for injured soldiers. Teachers increasingly used movies or radio broadcasts in class. As part of the pre-induction program, physical education requirements were increased to an hour per day in every grade. Behind-the-wheel driver's education, introduced in the 1930s, also came of age as a measure designed to save time in the military training of recruits. More significant than these developments was the liberalization of high school graduation requirements. Beginning in 1942, with the blessing of the regional accrediting body, the North Central Association, Detroit high schools permitted students in the academic tracks to substitute pre-induction and vocational courses for academic courses required for graduation. In addition, as large numbers of students took after-school jobs, the Board of Education approved a plan to allow work experience to satisfy as much as 1/5 of the total class credits students could take each semester. School leaders declared that the goal of these changes was the complete transformation of the curriculum in favor of vocational education. Much of this must have been smoke and mirrors. Despite these policies, there seems to have been little change in what students actually studied in high school. Table 1 compares the percent distribution of classes offered in Detroit's 15 comprehensive high schools in various subject fields in the fall terms of 1939 and 1944. While there was a small increase in the share of courses devoted to practical subjects, most of this occurred in the commercial department rather than in the vocational department that was more directly related to the war effort. Furthermore, this modest increase did not come at the expense of Chaucer and Latin but rather at the expense of the social studies, another area that can be thought of as more clearly related to the war effort than English literature or biology. Even this increase in commercial course enrollments was probably more the result of a much higher dropout rate among young men compared to young women during the war years than of any deliberate shift in curriculum offerings. Males made up 44% of 10th graders but only 39% of 12th graders in 1944. Also, males constituted 47% of graduates in 1939, but only 39% of graduates in 1944. Females held a large majority of the places in the city's 2 commercial high schools. A similar comparison for Michigan as a whole shows a somewhat different result, but not one that supports the policy rhetoric of the period. Despite the calls for an expansion of the vocational side of the curriculum to support the war effort, course registrations in Michigan high schools remained largely unchanged, see Table 2. In contrast to Detroit, there was a statewide decline in registrations in commercial subjects which, accreditation officials explained, was due to the loss of teachers to the war effort. If they were right about this, why this loss did not occur in Detroit remains a mystery. The steep rise in registrations in physical education, however, was likely related to pre-induction programs. But if the war had little impact on student course selection in Detroit and Michigan high schools, it may have had a decisive effect on the school experiences of black high schoolers. Drawn by high-paying jobs in the defense industries, African Americans moved to Detroit in large numbers in the 1940s, growing from 149,120 in 1940 to 300,506 a decade later, from about 9% to 16.4% of the city's total population. In the schools, the percentage of black students rose from approximately 5% in 1922 to 17% in 1946.12. In sharp contrast to the rhetoric of emphasizing practical, vocational training during the war, the high schools approached the problem of increasing numbers of black students in exactly the same way that they had approached the flood of white working-class youth in the 1930s, by absorbing them into the general track. Reliable data on track placements in the high schools are much rarer than data on course offerings. However, a report by the Mayor's Committee on Youth Problems, in reference to the 1943 race riot, indicated that 22% of Detroit high schoolers had been placed in the general track. A much more detailed report by the Detroit Commission on Human Relations for the Schools. While African American students represented just under 12% of all high schoolers in the 1946-47 school year, African Americans made up 18% of those following the general track, an overrepresentation of 50%. Their access to the city's 4 specialized high schools was also somewhat blocked, since they made up only 9% of the enrollments of these schools. To summarize the impact of the war on the curriculum, war preparedness may have been an important theme of high school curriculum development of the 1940s, but the selection of courses available to students seems to have been little affected. At war's end, the general track enrolled more than a quarter of Detroit high school students and an even larger share of its black high school students. The general track was alive and well in Detroit and Michigan after the war, despite the temporary shift to speaking of the needs of a nation at war instead of the needs of adolescents. As has been well documented, after World War II curriculum policy debate on the national level was dominated by the emergence of the life adjustment movement. This movement aimed toward expanding and elaborating the high school curriculum as a means for recovering the losses in enrollments due to the war and for re-establishing the trend toward universal attendance that had been interrupted by the war. While it is far from clear just how effective these reforms were or how deeply they penetrated actual practice, the suggested reforms were quite similar to those adopted in Detroit in the Depression and, most importantly, they targeted a similar group of students. Charles Prosser, the acknowledged father of the movement, referred to these students as the 60% of our youth of secondary school age who were not well served by either a college preparatory or a vocational curriculum and whose abilities and needs dictated a more general, life education, program. Point 14. Backed by the U.S. Office of Education, life adjustment was the most widely discussed curriculum reform of the late 1940s and early 1950s. Proponents of the reform claimed that it would transform American education by universalizing high school attendance, reducing the dropout rate, respecting individual differences among students, providing a differentiated curriculum with course offerings that had immediate relevance to the lives of young people, promoting self-esteem and building character, acquainting students with their communities, and gradually engaging them with the wider world. But like the noble goals of Depression-era educators who sought to keep students in school by watering down the high school course of study, life adjustment also, unfortunately, contributed to greater educational inequality. Indeed, life adjustment educators described their students in almost precisely the same manner as did urban educators in the 1930s. As Richard Hofstadter notes, the life adjustment theorists were explicit about the qualities they attributed to the neglected 60% who needed life adjustment education. These were mainly children from unskilled and semi-skilled families who had low incomes and provided a poor cultural environment. They began school later than others, continued to be retarded in school, made low grades, scored lower on intelligence and achievement tests, lacked interest in schoolwork, and were *less emotionally mature, nervous, feel less secure. The usual interpretive model of post-war development suggests that the life adjustment movement, pushing a needs-driven expansion of the range of high school offerings and lasting from about 1945 to 1953, was overwhelmed by a wave of conservative criticisms from such writers as Arthur Bester, Admiral Hyman Rickover, Mortimer Smith, and others. This conservative reaction was reinforced by Sputnik in 1957 and by the National Defense Education Act a year later, consequently renewing an emphasis on basic academic subjects such as mathematics, science, and foreign languages. This tendency lasted at least until the late 1960s, when a shift in national priorities toward the elimination of poverty in America caused a renewed emphasis on vocational training in the high schools, best exemplified by the career education movement of the Nixon years. 16. As a description of what actually happened in the high schools, this model seems to have little salience in Detroit or Michigan, and we doubt its salience as a general model for the nation. While no doubt there were exactly these wild swings in the ongoing debate about the high school curriculum, no one has shown to our satisfaction that the offerings of high schools or the patterns of student registrations reflected these changes. In our view, the period from 1945 to 1965 was, with respect to course offerings and registrations, a period marked by continuity and stability rather than by sharp pendulum swings, see Table 4. In Detroit, the trends that were evident from 1928 to 1940, the dramatic decline of study in foreign language and mathematics and the increase in social studies, vocational subjects, and other non-academic offerings did not reappear during the next quarter century. Apart from the slight vocationalizing of the curriculum related to the war effort, it is striking how little change occurred in the face of the massive debates about curriculum that took place after the war. In light of these data, the life adjustment movement appears to have legitimated changes that had already taken place a decade earlier. Its effect was to solidify these changes and make them relatively impervious to the waves of attacks that would occur in the 1950s and 1960s. What did change, though this is more difficult to document, was the content of graduation requirements, such as those adopted by Detroit in both the Great Depression and World War II. In other words, while the share of student time devoted to, for instance, mathematics no longer declined, students increasingly fulfilled math requirements by taking less rigorous courses. Table 5 illustrates this point. In both 1946 to 47 and 1966 to 67, the Detroit schools required 1 year of mathematics for graduation, and while neither shop math nor business math could be used to meet this requirement, courses in general arithmetic, general mathematics, or refresher mathematics could be. In the 1946 to 47 school year, the only high schools in which the share of math enrollments devoted to remedial and general mathematics courses exceeded 10% were those with exceptionally high black enrollments. 20 years later, most high schools enrolled from a fifth to over one-half of their students in remedial and general mathematics courses, and the rough relationship to the racial composition of the student body continued to hold. The relative stability in the distribution of high school subjects, shown in Table 4, was not a sign of a great public consensus or of an absence of criticism and debate. In fact, all of the criticisms of the deterioration of the curriculum that raged on the national scene in the 1950s were raised as well in Detroit, but they simply had no impact on actual curriculum practices. As we will show, they were successfully deflected by school officials. Typifying the early phase of criticism of educational quality was a 9-part series in the Detroit Free Press running in December 1946. The series raised a by now familiar question: are our schools failing in their job of preparing youth to earn a living in business and industry? For the most part, the series was a litany of anecdotes about the typist who did not know how to put the paper in the machine or the 1% of 10th graders who could not add a column of 8 small numbers. But the series also included interviews with the director of education at Chrysler's Dodge main plant, a retired teacher with strong views about the loss of honesty in grading practices, the secretary of the Retail Merchants Association, a group of deny high school students who had prepared a position paper on what the modern high school needed to be, a University of Michigan professor who had compiled the grade point averages of various Detroit high school graduates attending the university. And finally, with Arthur Dandino, the superintendent of the Detroit schools. The main theme of the series was the failure of the schools to stress the fundamentals, the abandonment of drill in favor of socialized education, etc. References to the general track were, at most, oblique, but the charge that the schools were putting the emphasis on entertainment and on getting along with people at the expense of cognitive skill development was clear enough. Superintendent Dandino dismissed the criticisms, declaring that because the high schools were operating on democratic principles instead of serving only a select, wealthy, or highly intelligent group, the educational average is bound to go down. Occasional critical assessments of educational quality in the Detroit public schools appeared throughout the next decade, usually in connection with millage or bonding elections, but it was the launching of Sputnik that produced the next crescendo of criticism. When it came, it was much more sharply focused on the high school curriculum than were the earlier critiques. The Free Press opened an attack on Detroit's high schools on March 17, 1958, with the first of a 4-part series with the theme, "What is a High School Diploma Worth?" The series featured interviews with local personnel managers, who testified that the diploma was not worth very much, laying the blame on the weakening of standards that had occurred in the general, vocational, and commercial tracks, and on what they called cafeteria-style education. A report that 90% of the more than 1,000 graduates taking the Wayne County Civil Service exam for entry-level clerical jobs failed the test, a test of verbal and arithmetic skills said to represent the 7th grade level, and a comparison of the transcripts of 30 1958 graduates of Pershing High School with those of 30 1933 graduates, finding overall that Detroit high school students, in 1933, spent 20% more time on academic learning than today's students do. Specifically, the 1958 students took 12% less English, 10% less history, 40% less mathematics, and 40% less science. The general track students of 1933 took only a few percentage points less academic work than the academic track students of 1958.18. 10 days later, the Detroit News published its own series on the troubled state of the Detroit public schools. Like the Free Press, the articles in the News were highly critical of the system, but unlike its rival paper, the News gave school officials an opportunity to respond to its charges. The News series, based in part on interviews of 30 recent Detroit area graduates now in college, echoed the criticisms leveled by the Free Press. Typical remarks were, most high school courses are geared to the mediocre student and the slow learner. It's too easy to get A's and the textbooks aren't practical. Teachers don't tell how to study, stress memorizing, and fail to encourage thinking in their classes. There's too much stress on social activities. It's too easy to slide through high school on SNAP courses. These college freshmen called for ability tracking, more emphasis on study skills and thinking skills, and more homework. In a continuation of these interviews the next day, the main themes were the need for more emphasis on basic skills, such as reading and composition, and complaints that teachers in math and science were not well prepared. The admissions directors of Michigan's 3 large state universities seconded the complaints of the students. Freshman failures were largely caused by a lack of basic skills, particularly reading, writing, and study skills, the admissions directors argued. But in a notable dissent from the general tone of these criticisms, the registrar at Michigan State University warned that the high school should not go back to the curriculums of the past. There's a battle going on between those who want only to teach college preparatory courses and those who want a well-rounded program, he said. It's true we could solve many of our problems today in educating the slow learner by going back 20 years to a course of study which would rid the schools of that type of student. But courses in shop and the like are essential if we are to prepare the non-college student for outside life. Finally, on the last day of this second series of critical articles, school officials got their chance to respond. Speaking for the Detroit Board of Education was its president, Leonard Cale, a steel wholesaler and part-time philosophy teacher at Wayne State University. Cale answered these criticisms by blaming understaffed and overcrowded classrooms. Cale pointed out that Detroit voters had defeated a $33 million millage proposal in April 1957, a tax hike that was intended to provide 700 more classrooms in the city. Deflecting criticism away from the schools and onto the voters, Castle said, "Our children know the community does not care enough about their education to provide the seats and the staff necessary for a full day's educational program. They cannot be taught another attitude until the community itself revalues its standards." There can be no doubt about the financial difficulties of the system, but the papers had raised issues that they felt had nothing to do with finance. 2 What about the cafeteria-style education, the decline of standards? In what had already become a classic evocation of the threat of the dropout, Arthur McGrath, Assistant Superintendent for Secondary Education, said, "We are trying to keep the dropout rate down and keep youngsters in school as long as possible by offering interesting, attractive, and constructive courses. Don't forget, many students are late bloomers and don't realize the value of education until they are seniors." Speaking for the teachers and admitting that many of their former students' complaints were accurate, Antonia Kohler, president of the Detroit Federation of Teachers, and Raymond Rock, head of the Detroit Education Association, predictably cited working conditions, particularly class size, as the chief causes of the difficulties. But much of the blame belongs to the students themselves, since many students don't realize the value of education until they reach college. They suddenly discover they should have taken other courses and consequently find themselves in trouble. 22. But school equality, curriculum, and the decline of the academic ideal, Detroit, 1930-68. David L. Angus and Jeffrey E. Murrell. The question of whether high school students should follow a uniform academic program or choose from options in a differentiated curriculum has reemerged in the 1980s as one of the most crucial issues facing American public education. In its latest incarnation, brought to life by the publication of A Nation at Risk and subsequent proposals and manifestos, the debate has been framed as one between educational excellence, on the one hand, and equality of educational opportunity, on the other. In response to increasing demands for excellence throughout the 1980s, many states and local districts adopted minimum academic competency exams for high school graduation or for passing from the 8th grade into high school, and set or raised the minimum level of academic performance required for participating in extracurricular activities. Yet many of these efforts were met with a chorus of criticism from educators, liberal politicians, and minority leaders who argued that such changes would have a disproportionate effect on Black and Hispanic youths, blocking their participation in athletics and other activities, raising their already high dropout rates, and in countless other ways stunting their aspirations for entry into the academic mainstream. These criticisms echoed a very old idea in American education, a definition of equal educational opportunity, which we believe has done immeasurable damage over the years to the educational experience of American youth in general, and African American youth in particular. This idea holds that the high school must do everything it can to keep everyone in school until graduation, even if this means keeping graduation requirements low and in reach of all, developing courses that are designed to be relevant, entertaining, and with minimal academic content, worrying more about how students feel about themselves than about what they know and are able to do, concentrating on meeting the needs of youth rather than on offering educational experiences that prepare them for adulthood. From this point of view, failure to adopt these measures constitutes a denial of equal educational opportunity. These educational values emerged around the opening of the 20th century, but we believe that they attained their great salience in the 1930s and after, in the form of the high school general track. We will trace the development of the general track and the educational vision that drove this development from its coming of age in the 1930s through a series of challenges to it in each of the next 3 decades. Revisionist historians have focused on the development of high school vocational programs in the 1890 to 1920 period as the key event in the emergence of a school system committed to sorting and tracking students along gender, class, and racial lines. We contend that the more consequential development, both for the long-term decline of American secondary education and for its increasing inability to promote high educational achievement in the face of non-supportive family and social background conditions, is the custodial, needs-oriented general track. We suggest that this development has particularly affected urban Black students and that today's movement toward all-Black, all-male Afrocentric academies is in part a consequence of the failure of urban educational leaders in the post-war period to respond to Black demands for higher educational standards for Black children. In Detroit, as in many cities around the country, the 1930s witnessed a startling expansion of high school enrollments. Many of the new students were drawn from lower working-class homes and had not so much chosen to go to or stay in high school as they had been forced to do so by the collapse of the youth labor market during the Depression. They posed a severe challenge to high school educators. As one leader put it in 1934, one of the most important problems of the secondary schools in the next decade will be to formulate curriculums and to reorganize the subject matter for those pupils who have not the ability to master subjects in the college preparatory and the commercial curriculums. The chief reason for this immediate problem is the economic situation, which has forced into the secondary schools thousands of people who formerly left school at the age of 16 or 17 to go to work. In the 1920s, educators assumed that these students either would have left school for work or have been absorbed into the wide variety of vocational curricula offered by the high schools. The Depression had the twofold impact of causing educators to lose faith in the vocational training function of the high school and to speak quite openly of the school's custodial responsibility. The key to meeting this new responsibility was steering students away from the more rigorous college preparatory or vocational curricula, which educators assumed were too difficult for these students, and into less demanding programs. During the 1920s, Detroit high school students followed one of 4 curricular tracks: college preparatory, technical, commercial, or general. Students entered the tracks on the basis of standardized test scores, grades, teacher recommendations, and family consultations with counselors or administrators. Because the general curriculum was the least rigorous intellectually and had the largest number of elective courses, school administrators believed it was the best place to absorb many of the Depression-era students. As early as 1932, however, school officials found an alarming rise in the number of failures in that program. With teenage unemployment running as high as 50%, school leaders in Detroit believed that it was their social as well as their educational responsibility to keep students in school and, therefore, sought ways to reduce the failure rate. In response to that goal, curriculum planners began to reshape the general curriculum to make it easier for students to stay in school and graduate. Rather than tamper with the 1927 graduation requirements that mandated 3 years of English, 3 years of social studies, 1 year of science, 1 year of math, 1 year of health, physical education, and 1 year of either industrial arts, fine arts, or home economics, they made it easier for students in the general program to fulfill these requirements. For example, they introduced descriptive science courses to satisfy the district science requirement, stripped of a laboratory component and focused on such relevant topics as how vacuum cleaners worked. Concurrently, the curriculum planners encouraged teachers to introduce into required courses relevant topics, such as traffic safety, into civics classes. The system also boasted many new practical electives, such as courses in personal standards in which boys studied such weighty matters as problems of diet, dress, etiquette, jobs, relations with girls, and personal hygiene, while girls had units on appearing to advantage, homemaking, use of leisure time, bride and trousseau. Teachers reported that these courses were extremely popular. As a consequence of these changes, as well as of continued high unemployment, graduation rates soared in the 1930s. In a previous study, we have shown that in the 15 Detroit comprehensive high schools between 1928 and 1940, the proportion of classes devoted to English, art, and the sciences remained stable, the proportion in mathematics and foreign language declined, But school officials were not alone in their attempts to both defend the school's curricular strategy and deflect the criticisms onto other groups. When the president of the University of Michigan was asked by the Economic Club of Detroit to provide information on how much math and science was being studied by Michigan high schoolers, he turned for an answer to the director of the university's Bureau for Accrediting the state's high schools. 23 Based on a tabulation of the daily schedules that high schools sent in with their annual accreditation reports, the director's report was clearly meant to be reassuring. It showed that of the 668 accredited high schools covered in the report, only 19 were not offering Algebra 1, 16 were not offering chemistry, and 49 were not offering physics. But the director could not resist telling the president what he thought the real curricular problems were. It seems to me that it is not the amount of science and mathematics offered, nor the diversity of science and mathematics offered, that poses a problem. Neither does it appear that the percentage of students taking these courses is out of line. As a matter of fact, in analyzing 668 schools and programs, the areas of the curriculum that tend to be slighted are not mathematics or science but the following, and in this order: art, orchestra and string work, boys' vocal work. This left little doubt as to where the university's accrediting bureau stood. As Detroit and the nation agonized over academic standards and international competition, the bureau refused to acknowledge these priorities. Another serious problem is what the bureau thought should be done with respect to mathematics and science. Its position on this point shows that the standard setters hope to contain or deflect the criticisms by turning them into an argument about the gifted child. Our accreditation visits reveal that most of the accredited high schools in Michigan are attempting to organize their classes in science and mathematics around the abilities, needs, and plans of their pupils. There is a sincere attempt to offer more science and more mathematics to the superior and gifted child. 24 Placing this construction on the issue completely evaded such criticisms as the Free Press's contention that the average Detroit high school graduate did not know enough mathematics to pass the Wayne County Civil Service examination. Certainly some nationally visible critics at the time were calling for more emphasis on the gifted student, but this was coupled with a broader concern about the lack of standards and achievement in basic subjects for all high school students. The agency was apparently blind to this concern. Point 25. Why did educators seem so unresponsive to those who questioned the quality of education in these years? It is because educators defined their challenges in terms radically different from those of their critics. In Detroit, as in the rest of the nation, the challenge of the immediate post-war years was to recapture the level of secondary school enrollments that had been lost during the war. 2 This was seen as a particularly pressing problem against the backdrop of rising youth unemployment and juvenile delinquency rates and a high dropout rate. As they had been for many years, educators were convinced that the solution was to develop courses that were interesting, attractive, and constructive. In the years between 1945 and 1957, every report on the high school curriculum in Detroit called for expanding programs in vocational education. Most specific recommendations, however, mention such courses as home and family life education, driver's education, and citizenship education, courses that fit more neatly into the general track. It was widely believed that courses such as these made school more attractive and kept the dropout rate in check. In addition, Detroit had another problem that it addressed by increasing such courses and placements in the general track: the increasing numbers of African American students in the public schools. According to Patricia Cayo Sexton's study of economic inequalities in Detroit's public schools, by 1957 the percentage of Detroit students following the general track curriculum had reached more than one-third. Over the same period, it is estimated that black school enrollment rose from over 16% to nearly 45% of the total. 27 Furthermore, her study showed much higher general track placement in lower-income schools, making it quite likely that the track placement of black students exceeded even this figure of one-third. The basic rationale for all of this was given full expression in a somewhat unlikely source, a 1958 report of the Citizens Advisory Committee on School Needs, CAC. In spring 1957, following the disastrous defeat of the millage proposal, the Detroit Board of Education asked George Romney, then president of American Motors Corporation, to head the CAC. While the main charge to the committee was to produce a thorough and objective study of the physical plant needs of the city's school system, it was empowered to investigate a broad range of other matters, including the adequacy of the curriculum. In studying the high school's curriculum, the committee was aided by a number of outside consultants. The consultants' report provides a strikingly clear exposition of the thinking that had dominated high school curriculum planning in Detroit since the 1930s and in much of the nation since World War II. Giving maximum attention to the general track, the consultants started from the premise that the primary purpose of this curriculum was dropout prevention. They recommended that the aims of this curriculum be sharpened and clarified, that there be more required and fewer elective courses, and that such needs-oriented courses as hygiene, childcare, and library reading be expanded to 2-year offerings. They left no doubt as to just how fundamental this curriculum was to the American educational vision. There are some laymen, and a few teachers, who expressed the wish that many of these students now in high school and in the general curriculum would join this dropout group. Good riddance, they say. This is a denial of equality of educational opportunity, which is one of the basic freedoms that this country and other democratic societies have subscribed to. We have always believed that every boy and girl is entitled to all the growth and development that education can help him, make. To do this for all types of students, it cannot offer all an identical program. Identical education does not provide equal educational opportunity. It denies it. The school must offer all types of courses to do for each what a limited narrow program will do for a few. Otherwise, public education is being used to produce a large group of second-class citizens by denying them a secondary education or forcing them to take one of little value to them. Italics in original, point 2. Despite these expert opinions, however, there were many in the community who felt that it was the general curriculum itself that was producing second-class citizens and who had quite a different notion of equality of opportunity. To many Americans in the late 1950s, equality of opportunity meant an equal chance to go to college. Point 29. From this perspective, placement in the general track was in itself a denial of equal opportunity. Educators, on the other hand, believed that equal opportunity was an equal chance to graduate from high school, and that this was best assured by providing a variety of curricular programs and by seeing that students were placed in programs that fitted their abilities and interests and that they would see as immediately related to their lives. Nowhere was this difference in interpretation of the meaning of equality of opportunity more sharply drawn than in the emerging criticisms of the schools by Detroit's black leaders. In 1955, Dr. Remus Robinson became the first African American to be elected to the Detroit Board of Education. In March 1958, he became president-elect and ended his relative silence on racial matters. In an interview with the Michigan Chronicle, he detailed a list of grievances against the school system. Teacher assignments and the racial isolation created by school attendance boundaries came in for the heaviest criticism, but Dr. Robinson also went on to complain about the system's use of intelligence tests for grade placement. Negro children out of the South are given tests according to Midwestern standards. To presume these children are not intelligent on the basis of standards new to them is unfortunate and unfair. One consequence of this, according to Robinson, was that at some high schools, in the center section of the city, courses were watered down so that students were hampered in college or failed to measure up to college entrance requirements. If the curriculum is heavily influenced by previous testing, students are given less than their ability and as a result are unprepared to meet the challenge of college. 30. Perhaps emboldened by these forceful views, the Parents Club at McMichael Junior High School, a mostly black school feeding into Detroit's Northwestern High School, blasted the school for low academic standards. Getting no satisfaction from the school principal, the parents met with Assistant Superintendent McGrath, who offered to allow 9th grade students at McMichael to take science and standard English courses not regularly offered at the school. But McGrath pointed out to the parents that students coming to McMichael from elementary school were not prepared to do junior high school work. Not surprisingly, the McMichael parents were not satisfied with this, and on February 6, 1958, they met with Superintendent Samuel Brownell to present these problems. 1. Students were not required to work hard. 2. McMichael was woefully lacking in adequate equipment, except in sewing, cooking, and shop, and 3. There was no set discipline policy. Brownell told the parents that it might take 4 to 6 weeks to take care of these problems, but when he was telephoned in mid-March, he said he assumed that McGrath had taken care of things. Oscar Dotson, head of the Parents Club, pointed out that the students were using pamphlets in the science course and had not been encouraged to buy the regular English textbook. Dotson expanded his criticisms to include low academic standards at Northwestern High School and other predominantly black elementary and secondary schools. On March 24, Dotson and others aired their grievances at a board meeting. They mentioned the lack of college preparatory courses, of adequate textbooks and other equipment, and of an adequate punishment policy and an efficient counseling system. They further decried the failure of teachers to encourage students to strive for high standards and complained of teachers' indifference to bad conduct. Brownell responded that he had attempted to correct some of these conditions. He defended the use of pamphlets instead of a text in the science class on the grounds that students needed to have the most current information available. And he said that, overall, every effort was being made to counsel students to their best advantage. 32. On April 12, this skirmish dropped from public view, but in its final moment, McMichael's principal, Luther Hale, once more invoked what had become a litany, the concept of a needs-based approach rather than a goals-based approach to curriculum and student placement. Mr. Hale said that the adverse publicity that his school had received was not fair. The faculty spends a lot of time studying the records of incoming 7 Boliviano. We try and group them by achievement tests, IQ scores, teacher ratings, and reading score according to their learning capabilities. We will take the children along as fast as they will go. Our teachers are making a sincere attempt to adjust the work to meet a student's needs. In the present 7B grade, of 5 sections, there is 1 section of the better students. The other 4 sections are made up of mediocre students. 13. Despite the criticisms by Robinson and the black parents, school officials continued to rest comfortably, believing that low student achievement should be met with continued low expectations, a simplified curriculum, and easy grading and promotions practices. Over the next few years, Detroit's black community became increasingly outraged about conditions in predominantly black schools, particularly the city's high schools. Hopes for change were buoyed in 1964 by the election to the board of 3 liberal candidates committed to improving the quality of education in predominantly black schools. By 1970, however, these hopes were shattered, the victim of numerous financial crises, racial politics over decentralization and desegregation, and an unfortunate reassertion of the needs-based curriculum in the guise of black nationalism. 34. Late in 1965, the NAACP and other civil rights groups began a concerted campaign to improve conditions in Detroit's secondary schools. They issued a powerful report on the schools, which decried the small number of black guidance counselors in the high schools, 17 out of 116, arguing that racially biased counselors routinely track large numbers of black students out of the college preparatory curriculum. In addition, the report deplored the failure of school leaders to include units on black history and culture in the curriculum and decried the physical conditions in black schools. 3. By the mid-1960s, most of the predominantly black high schools in Detroit had become both literally and figuratively general track institutions. A 1964 study by the Detroit Urban League, for example, found that the predominantly black Northwestern and Northeastern high schools had larger numbers of students enrolled in the general courses than in college preparatory or trade-oriented curriculum. Even in Mumford High School, probably the most academically oriented of the city's integrated schools in 1967, 22% of black students were in the general track compared to only 2% of whites. Furthermore, it appears that the general track philosophy in these schools rested on the premise that the less teachers demanded of students, the more tractable the students would become. As one northern high school teacher reported, the social promotion policy at the school was so pervasive that if there is more than a 15% failure rate, we are called into the principal's office to explain why. 36. In April 1966, a massive walkout by the students from the largely black northern high school dramatically focused the attention of the city on these issues. While the decline in academic quality was emblematic of problems in all the black high schools in the city, the problems were particularly poignant at Northern. As Carl D. Gregory, a Wayne State professor and Northern alumnus, put it, Northern was the outstanding high school in Detroit in the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s. But as the racial composition of the school changed in the post-war years, Gregory noted, Northern became primarily a custodial institution complete with police as an apparent part of the administration, and was only on the surface an institution where systematic learning took place. 37. The catalyst for the walkout was the decision by Principal Arthur T. Carty to ban an editorial in the school newspaper that denounced inferior education at Northern. The editorial decried the lack of adequate college preparatory courses at the school, the low academic standards, and the policy of social promotion, and it compared Northern unfavorably to a predominantly white school in the northwest section of the city. While it is doubtful that the editorial writer had more than anecdotal evidence for his comparison with the white high school, Table 5, above, supports his contention, showing clearly a relationship between a school's racial composition and the level of its mathematics offerings. The suppression of the editorial quickly escalated into a boycott of Northern to protest Carty's leadership. Initially, community leaders greeted the protest with amazement and approval. As one observer put it, "Did you ever hear 1,000 kids cheering at the idea of a good algebra class?" They did. The Free Press editorialized that this was one student protest that deserves applause. School Board President Remus Robinson declared, "The public has learned that the general concept of the attitude of Negro youth toward education is wrong. This should help correct the general impression that the inner city is a jungle where nobody has any desire for progress, law and order or virtue. These students are demanding a better education." 3 asterisk. But over the next week, such positive attitudes disappeared as the character of the protest shifted from an action primarily concerned with pedagogical change to a confrontation over the question of retaining Arthur Carty as principal. That issue became a test of wills between the school leaders and the protesters, a test that the students won on 25 April when Brownell and the board agreed to transfer Carty to central administration. 39. While the decision to remove Carty ended the walkout, it had 2 important negative consequences. First, the decision polarized the city. Blacks generally praised the decision, seeing it as evidence of greater sensitivity to their concerns, but whites largely decried it, claiming that the board had knuckled under to mob action and abdicated adult authority within the school system. 42. The decision made it far more likely that future discussions of educational quality in predominantly black schools would focus on personnel issues, often with strong racial overtones rather than on curricular issues. As a result of both of these developments, the initial demands of the Northern walkout ending the second-class education in the school by re-emphasizing academic values virtually disappeared from educational debate in the city. Worse, during this period a new version of the needs curriculum appeared, espoused now by militant black leaders, rather than professional educators, but nevertheless bearing many hallmarks of that earlier philosophy of education. It has become quite commonplace to acknowledge the sharp ideological shift that occurred in the civil rights movement in the middle 1960s, from colorblindness to color consciousness, from integration to separatism, from freedom now to black power. In Detroit, it is striking the extent to which this shift was expressed in educational terms and how it seems connected to the very curriculum trends that we have been tracing. This shift was most apparent in a June 1967 protest at the Detroit Board of Education led by Reverend Albert Cleage, Jr., the most militant black leader in the city. Heading a newly organized inner-city parents' council, Cleage presented the board with a damning report on educational conditions in predominantly black schools whose low test scores and high dropout rates were, he maintained, a result of deliberate racist policies and practices of the schools. The report argued that the basic threat to the Afro-American child's pride and self-image is the preponderance of white administrators and teachers in inner-city schools. The preponderance of white educators underscores the black child's sense of powerlessness and inferiority. These white administrators, aided and abetted by biased textbooks which present a distorted picture of the Afro-American child's history and culture, serve to rob him of any motivation to learn and to develop because he sees nothing around him to make learning and self-development seem to offer either an avenue of escape from the conditions in which he lives or an instrument by which he can change these conditions. 42. The Inner City Parents Report marked a profound shift in the nature of the debate about educational change in the city. Prior to 1967, civil rights organizations, such as the NAACP and the Urban League, focused their attention on getting equal programs, equal treatment, and equal quality education in the Detroit schools. Indeed, this was precisely what the students at Northern had demanded when they walked out a year earlier. Cleage and the inner city parents, however, maintained that such equality, particularly in terms of curriculum, was part of the problem in predominantly black schools. They called for a radically new curriculum in these schools, a curriculum stressing black history, black culture, the arts, dance, and creative writing. The curriculum for inner-city schools, they argued, must differ markedly from the curriculum of the outlying schools. It mattered little that Detroit was already becoming a national leader in the development of multicultural reading texts and the introduction of black studies. Cleage's demands had the effect of shifting the debate from curriculum reform to the issue of community control of schools. By late 1967, Detroiters had become increasingly caught up in furious conflicts about the merits of decentralization or desegregation. Nevertheless, when curriculum arguments were put forth by Cleage and other advocates of community control, they had a striking resemblance to the positions taken by proponents of the needs curriculum in the 1940s and 1950s. These arguments presupposed that, 1. The primary function of the schools is to meet the needs of young people. 2. Key to meeting these needs are relevant courses and curriculum materials. 3. Different students need different types of curricular materials and courses. 4. Learning about oneself and one's local community is a prerequisite to learning about the wider world. And 5. Promoting positive self-images and self-esteem is a central goal of education. Over the next few years, amid increasingly militant and, at times, violent protests in favor of community control in Detroit, these curricular demands remained constant. Thus, the demands for stronger academic subjects were not only overwhelmed by conflicts over community control, but they were once again driven from the educational arena by a militant new incarnation of the needs curriculum. Nothing better demonstrates the degree to which these trends took root in Detroit than the 1968 report of the High School Study Commission, HSSC, created in the aftermath of the Northern High School boycott to investigate the problems of secondary education in the city. Despite the fact that a large share of the reports by committees investigating individual high schools stressed the earlier themes of track placement, social promotion, and the general low level of academic achievement by black students, the HSSC final report stressed political and structural changes to the system. The report gave a major boost to the campaign for community control and decentralization of the school system and directed attention away from more traditional recommendations designed to deal with such long-standing problems as the lack of resources to repair deteriorating buildings and to hire enough educational staff. The report was virtually silent on such issues as ending the practice of social promotion and the problem of the general track. 44. Perhaps the most unfortunate aspect of these developments was that they once again stifled the desires of black parents for fundamental improvements in educational quality. Indeed, a 1971 survey of black Detroiters found less than enthusiastic support for community control, more black studies, or integration as a means for improving the education of black children. Rather, the survey identified strong support for traditional educational programs and practices akin to the demands made by the Northern students when they first walked out 5 years earlier. In December 1971, researchers working for New Detroit Incorporated interviewed a representative sample of 300 black Detroiters over the age of 18 to obtain their views about the public schools. When asked to rank 16 items associated with quality education, the respondents listed good teacher performance, equal educational funding, smaller classes, and good discipline as the 4 most important items. They listed items associated with community control, black studies, and racial integration of students 9th, 11th, and 12th, respectively. Responses to specific questions about these issues provided an even more dramatic picture of black attitudes. For example, 59% of the respondents believed that the race of their children's teachers made no difference in terms of student achievement, almost 26% wanted a mixed faculty of black and white teachers, and less than 9% wanted all or a majority of the teachers in predominantly black schools to be black. Of the 81% who favored schools with integrated student bodies, over half, 56%, did not want their children to attend schools outside their own neighborhood in order to have an integrated educational experience. In short, despite over 3 years of educational debates dominated by demands for community control, black power, and desegregation, black Detroiters rejected radical solutions to their children's educational problems and affirmed their belief that quality education rested on getting good teachers to instruct small classes in well-funded, orderly schools. Unfortunately, in the 1970s, as in the previous 3 decades, few people who were engaged in the great educational debates of the era paid much attention to such ideas. In the 1930s, Detroit school leaders were faced with an exploding high school enrollment made up largely of a new type of student whose academic abilities and motives were in doubt. The school leaders' response was to place major emphasis on tailoring the general curriculum to the needs of this group. In doing so, they fashioned an educational vision that would become increasingly important after World War II and would remain a vital part of America's unique concept of secondary education. Fundamental to this vision was the notion of the custodial function of the school, that keeping students in school as long as possible is itself a worthy goal regardless of whether the actual school experience is rich enough or effective enough to prepare them for the future. The curricular expression of this function is a regimen of courses light on intellectual content and heavy on entertainment value, and current interests underscore the curriculum that in the 1980s became popularly known as the shopping mall high school. With the onset of World War II, the conditions that had given rise to this approach were no longer evident, and school leaders were challenged to replace the aimlessness of the general track with the more purposeful and valuable vocational and college preparatory curricula. This they failed to do, discovering instead that the general curriculum was just the place to absorb the increasing numbers of black high schoolers that were migrating to Detroit during the war. Ignoring bitter complaints by black leaders and increasingly strident criticism from the press and business leaders about the declining quality of education in the city, school leaders persisted in the development and expansion of the general curriculum in the post-war years. They were supported in this by the University of Michigan's High School Accreditation Bureau, which had abandoned its historic mission to ensure for the colleges and universities the academic validity of a diploma from a given high school. The Bureau now demanded that high schools meet the needs of all boys and girls, needs that the agency believed it knew better than the community itself. 46. In the late 1950s, the climate was ripe once again for educational leaders in Detroit to shift from the increasingly criticized general curriculum. The national mood after Sputnik certainly supported a renewed emphasis on science, math, and foreign languages in the curriculum, on getting more poor but talented youth into college, and on providing high-quality technical training for those who did not wish to go to college. Again, the Detroit schools failed to respond to this challenge and set the stage for the bitter racial politics that would dominate in the 1960s. As late as the Northern High School boycott of 1966, Detroit school officials might have responded to black demands and media criticism with an active program to raise academic and behavioral standards in predominantly black high schools, to discourage the transfer of white students and experienced teachers out of those schools, to take steps to see that achievement standards were set and met in the elementary and junior high feeder schools, to increase the numbers of black counselors, and to invest in the textbooks, labs, and other equipment needed to pursue higher academic values in the city's comprehensive high schools. But this time, in failing to respond in these ways, school officials set the stage for an increasingly strident and militant black nationalist perspective to come to the fore. The city became irreversibly polarized racially. Whites in the middle class, both black and white, left the city in droves, and its tax base lost millions in the process. All the debates turned on questions of power and control, and the issues of educational quality that had troubled the city for a quarter century were swept aside. In 1969, amid protests calling for more black history and literature, Remus Robinson wondered why the students were not also clamoring for more physics and math. But by then, no one was listening either to moderates such as Robinson or to such questions. 47 Detroit's slide toward an educational disaster was well underway.
Please don't forget to like, subscribe, comment below, and turn on the notification bell.